welcome to the first video edition of Free-to-Play. Let me explain how this series works. In Free-to-Play, I use topics from gaming and gaming culture as a whole, illustrate topics in economics and libertarian philosophy. Start with this one. Let's go back to the most popular article I've ever written that explains why the law of supply and demand demonstrates how NES prices have gotten so insane. I used to be an NES collector, and like many collectors, I was unhappy with the meteoric rise in price for NES games. Games that just a few years ago went for less than $5 may now require a full $20 just for the privilege of owning the actual cart. Now this is just scratching the surface, not even mentioning the rare games like Nintendo World Championships or Little Samson. A lot of collectors are understandably getting upset at how fast prices rise and are blaming various sources for this. They blame things from AGN videos convincing the unwashed masses that having an NES around would be a good idea, to eBay scalpers, to the asshole resellers at the flea market offering the most common games for the standard price of an arm plus a leg. The blame has been spread around, but they miss the real perpetrators: us collectors. Those of us who buy used games have been the reason why prices have gone up, and it's perfectly fine that they did so. Prices are a fundamental part of the free market system, and the rising prices are proof the system is working. To begin with, let's take a look at the law of supply and demand. Now, before I get into that theory, let's use an analogy most of us are familiar with to grasp basics. Everyone knows that our favorite citrus fruits become more expensive in the winter, while they're cheap and plentiful in the summer. But many may not be considering here, the reason that the fruits become more expensive in winter is that while our appetite for citric goodness doesn't change, the supply that we can get our hands on does. Now, in the summer when the fruits are readily available here in the good old US of A, there's much more fruit, while we still won't eat the same amount, so the price drops. The law of supply and demand itself flows logically and is so ingrained in our thinking that most of the time we barely notice that we made use of it. And I just find it weird that a diamond is worth far more than a similar-sized chunk of graphite, even though both are the exact same chemical. They're both crystals of carbon. However, graphite goes for pennies, while diamonds go for a whole lot more than pennies. This is because the chemical processes that create graphite are far less intense than those that produce diamonds, and can therefore be done far cheaper. This is the simple idea behind the law of supply and demand. Basics of the law of supply and demand are fairly straightforward. If demand exceeds supply, prices rise. If supply exceeds demand, prices fall. While this doesn't sound like world-changing stuff, this simple law is the foundation upon which all of modern economics, whether capitalist or statist flavors, is firmly built. Now let's go back to the important things. Video games. Look at two games in the same series here, Contra and Contra Force. Contra is an absolute classic, a game that every single gamer worth their salt needs to play at least once in their lives. Meanwhile, Contra Force is a shoddy beat-em-up that got Contra names slapped on it for some reason in the US. Nobody in their right mind would prefer Contra Force to Contra, yet Contra Force goes for at least 3 times what Contra does. Why is that? Contra Force was only released in North America and was a crappy game released in 1992 near the end of the NES's lifespan. Meanwhile, Contra was released 2 years after the NES was, and was one of the highest selling games released for that console, selling millions of copies. Contra Force will end up costing more. Because of this, Contra Force ends up costing much more in the free market of collecting compared to its far superior brother, because it's harder to find. Contra Force is citrus in winter, while Contra is that lovely orange in mid-June. Contra itself, though, can teach us another way how supply and demand affects prices. Again, Contra is such an amazing game that anyone who wants to collect NES games is going to want to buy it. And that's perfectly reasonable. Again, it's fantastic. However, because there's so many people who are wanting to get in the collect hobby, and that's one of the games that they want when they get their NES, prices are going to drive up because the supply of Contra carts is completely static. It hasn't changed because they don't make Contra carts anymore. While the supply has stayed the exact same, demand has steadily rose for Contra, which is why, even though when I first bought it, when I started collecting NES games, I got it for $5 and thought that was a bit high. It goes for well over $20 now, and it has nothing to do with it being rare, just there's so many people wanting to buy it, so the price is going to naturally rise. Now, another point related to the physical items themselves is the hoarder phenomenon. Lately, it seems that whenever a certain game gets to be known for having a high price tag, or is believed to be heading in that direction, some individuals of questionable morals will buy as many copies as they can to intentionally lower the outstanding supply. This manipulation of the market means that people will pay a higher price for the game now that it's become even harder to find. While such manipulations can be profitable, they have a large risk if you're betting on something that becomes a collector's item, as many as the scalpers find out. A good example of this was the game Devil's Third on Wii U, which was hard to find at first. And so a lot of people were scalping it and buying large amounts of copies without remembering that Nintendo could still print them immediately. When Nintendo did a second pressing of them, prices immediately fell. A lot of scalpers paid out the butt and lost. Now, one of the foundations that allows the free market to work is information. But in the information age, we sometimes receive information that is not quite right or outright wrong, and this can skew the supply-demand curves. Keeping with the NES collecting theme, the infamous TV show Storage Wars offered some of the most blatant lies about gaming collecting you will ever find. This reality show features people who bid on auctions for unclaimed storage units, resell the items inside, and there's nothing wrong with that. The show is scripted as much as any sitcom because they always find some sort of treasure every episode, which anyone who actually has bought storage auctions can tell you is a rare thing indeed. Now, normally I would just write this off as dumb trash TV for white trash morons, but one episode became the bane of many of a game collector's existence. In this episode, one of the random morons in the show happens across an NES in one of the purchased units, and immediately declares it to be worth multiple thousands of dollars because it's, and I quote, an NES model 001. And he is right, it certainly is. Problem is, this is the standard gray toaster model NES that everyone knows and loves. In reality, a working model 001 is worth probably about $50 depending on condition. However, this lie spurred so many people to post Craigslist ads and eBay ads asking exorbitant amounts for an NES because they were convinced that it was worth so much. Part of the reason why you can blame Storage Wars is they legitimately claimed the NES 001 Toaster Edition with a copy of Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt was worth $500. Where they came up with this amount, I will never know. But then again, I don't have brain damage. Now, this is what a lot of collectors have attacked, and with very good reason. The people making the show were at best uninformed and at worst, actively trying to profit upon the ignorance of others. It's not a failure of the market that explains the current market prices, but it's a success of the market that does so. The market is simply reacting logically and according to the laws of economics to the rapid glut of new demand that swept our hobby. The golden prices rise because an unchanged amount of supply is receiving a much higher demand. To use the original analogy, imagine that one year the orange harvest was devastated by some kind of disaster, fungus, or bad weather. That year we would have a whole lot less oranges, but our demand usually doesn't change. It's a very static demand for fruit. We would expect to pay a higher price for the oranges that year because there's less of them to go around and people still want to buy as many as they can. Why should we treat video games as being any less of a commodity? The law of supply and demand also neatly explains why so many of the more expensive games are horrible, which on face value does seem counterintuitive. Now, this may be difficult, but take your time. Good games sell better than bad games, so there's less bad games around. Although the supply of bad games is static or even decreasing as more people have them, demand has been increasing as more and more people get into collecting. The games that were horrible sellers or released near the end of the console's lifespan often end up being the most desirable collector's items simply because they're rare. Now, I should note that there are exceptions to the rule that bad games sell badly. Call of Duty. And there's also exceptions to the rule that bad games are the only ones that are rare. For example, Earthbound is an extremely expensive Super NES cartridge, but it's also absolutely fantastic. Now let's look at how the laws of supply and demand officially remove bad sellers. Let's say the average market price of a given game is $20, and that's because the majority of people who are wanting to buy or sell think that's a reasonable amount to sell that cartridge at. Now there's always going to be someone trying to sell for a higher price, no matter what we're talking about. Video games, oranges, cars, what have you. So let's assume that they're selling this hypothetical game at $35, or almost twice the standard rate. Almost certainly they're going to have trouble selling it because anyone else can go and find a copy for cheaper. So why would they pay more money for the same thing? This leaves the reseller with two options. He can either keep trying to sell his inflated price and hope and find an idiot, or have to price his item lower to attract a buyer. Sellers who repeatedly overprice their wares often end up bankrupt because no one wants to buy things that are overpriced, especially for common items they can find for better prices elsewhere. Of course, retailers who sell for lower than the average price can often make a killing, which is exactly how Walmart made its money. Once the market has established a fair price, it's obviously in the seller's best interest to not stray too far from it. There's a term for when the market finds its ideal price, and it's called equilibrium. When a price is at equilibrium, as the name suggests, it balances supply and demand. A price above equilibrium will have too low of demand, while too low of a price will outstrip supply. Buyers don't want too high of a price, and sellers don't want too low of a price. Eventually, two meet in the middle and find the equilibrium price. This is the foundation of why the free market works. The instant exchange of information thanks to the price system, which is governed by supply and demand. But what happens if a price is artificially forced by government intervention? This screws up the supply and demand curve. If a government forces an artificially lower price, it will cause a large demand for a shrinking supply, thereby creating a shortage. However, if the government forces an artificially high price, supply will outgrow demand, creating a giant surplus. Neither one is desirable, as either consumers or producers end up getting screwed over by this. What I want to make a point of in this video is that the market doesn't fail because prices for retro games have become outrageous lately. It's working correctly. The system of price is one of the building blocks of capitalism and is likely the most familiar self-regulation that the market does. Retro games are actually one of the freest markets that still exists, so the pricing system is even more important. Instead of being the product of misinformed rooms who take reality TV as God's honest truth, the current state of high prices is a rational response to the immense supply. In fact, higher prices are the only rational response to the current flood of new collectors and retro gamers who want the real deal. The problem is that a lot of people who dislike capitalism just cannot understand that the market works by what is rational, not what feels right. The market operates so well because it is based upon everyone making decisions that work best for them. Every person's attempt to help themselves ends up helping everyone, as it actually keeps prices low. The only reason why NES prices have gotten to where they have is because we have driven them there, and it shows no signs of slowing down. Do you want prices to drop? Either hope for a collecting crash where all the demand plummets and people who are just in it for the fad or for money drop out, or don't pay the full price for a game and look for better deals elsewhere. Eventually the market corrects itself. Hope you enjoyed this little educational endeavor into free market economics. I want to continue down this route and explore more what makes the free market so amazing and how games can be used to illustrate that. As always, if you have comments, drop them down below or catch me on Twitter if I think I broke it. And as always, thanks for watching.